everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you all so much for coming out and joining us tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Jason Koo and Bessie Flores Zaldivar with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Jason's latest poetry collection, No Rest. Before we get officially started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, we'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Jason will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of No Rest online using the link in the live stream description. Now, let's get into this. Tonight is pretty special because Jason has opened up the doors of Brooklyn Poets for us so many times in the past with such an incredible spirit of collaboration and literary appreciation. And now, finally, I get to be the one introducing him and this wonderful new collection, No Rest, which beautifully and compellingly explores the present, past, and future, and all the ways our lives have been radically changed by living through so many unprecedented times for nearly the past decade. Jason and Bessie have much to discuss, and then Jason's going to read a little bit, so let me go ahead and introduce them to you all. Jason Koo is a second-generation Korean-American poet, educator, editor, and nonprofit director. He's the author of 4 full-length poetry collections, No Rest, More Than Mere Light, America's Favorite Poem, and Man on Extremely Small Island. His work has been published in Best American Poetry 2022, The Village Voice, and the Yale Review, among other places. He is an associate teaching professor of English and the director of creative writing at Quinnipiac University, and the founder and executive director of Brooklyn Poets. And as I mentioned earlier, Bessie Flores Zaldivar joins Jason in conversation tonight. Bessie is a Honduran writer and professor of fiction. They're currently based in the New Haven area, and their debut novel, Libertad, is forthcoming this August with Penguin Teen.
Yeah.
That's all for me. Please join me in giving Jason and Bessie a very warm welcome.
All right, man. Are you ready?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. This is a book full of very long poems, the longest poems I've ever read.
I apologize.
They're very long.
Yes.
And they allow for your speaker to insert little asides and for you to digress and sneak in commentary. In my experience of poetry workshops, other poets would tell you to cut that out or to make it into 3 poems. Does this want to be 3 poems, actually?
5 poems.
But I love that you do that. And I think that the length of the poems and these digressions and side commentary, it really allows you to portray how complex the speakers or feelings are about what's going on. And I know that in the poem you're going to read today, you have these small moments where you're like second guessing yourself. You say things like, I'm lucky this doesn't bother me that much, but we know that isn't true because you wrote a very long poem about it. What was your intention with this small moments of insecurity that the speaker lets on?
Okay.
When they second
do you want
guess
me to talk about long poems too?
Yeah.
It seems like it's a 2-part question.
It's a 2-part question. What's up with the long poems? Why do you include moments of second guessing?
Yeah, well, I like that you, I mean, it is a book of long poems. That was kind of like the intention of the whole project. Like with my 3rd book, I had written, I don't know if I should look at the camera or you. With my 3rd book, I had written this super long poem, longer than anything in this book. Or I could also look at the audience. This is very, I'm going to have to just do all 3. But I had written this like 50-page plus poem. It was like a diary-like poem that was also a letter poem to a friend of mine. That was the first time I'd ever written anything that long. And that's really where I think the seed of this book began, because you know, like I was gonna say, I grew up as a poet. I don't know if that's the right term, in the mid to late 90s and the early aughts. And back then, online journals were not yet really a thing. I mean, there were some, but they hadn't really, I mean, now they're really the norm. So when you were sending out poems, like basically anything over a page was like death to a poet. Like you were probably not going to get that published, especially if you were not that well known. So I was very conscious, like in the early days of like, I mean, you try not to be, but like you're sort of unconsciously or even consciously sort of limiting yourself. Like, especially if like there's a poem that's like a line or two over a page. You're going to try to find a way to, to cut it down. But that had never been my thing. Like I'd always been very into not only long poems, but long books in general. And it's probably a weird, I don't know where it comes from exactly. I don't know if it has to do with like my own personal trauma or like my taste or both. But like, I'm like, I would rather read like an 800-page book than like a 1-page poem, which again, sounds weird even to say aloud. And I knew that was always where my interest and my talent really lied. But earlier on, I could never really do that because I felt like I didn't have permission. And then I somehow wrote and published a couple of books, which did have some long poems in them. But I think the longest were like 8 or 9 pages, which just felt like really long to me. And then with this third book, I got to a place in my life where I was just like, you know what, fuck it. I stopped caring. And also by like 2013 or 14, like online publishing was really the norm, and you could actually publish long poems then. In fact, I had this 50+ page poem published online in the journal Prelude, which is they also ended up starting a press, and they published the book. So it was like, I think when they accepted it, it was like, okay. And then there was like a big response to the poem too, which I didn't expect. Like strangers were messaging me on Facebook about this poem, and I had never gotten that response for any of the shorter poems. So I was thinking maybe this is a thing. I should actually follow like what I really want to do and how I really want to write. So with the next book, I was like, I think I'm only going to do long poems. Nothing's going to be quite that long, but they will be like these anywhere from like 3 or 4 pages to like 20 pages. I think the longest in this book is like 20 pages or 21 pages. And to get to the insecurity part, which is my favorite thing to talk about, I think the reason why I favor long poems, not just writing them, but reading them, is that it just feels like a much truer picture of the self, or selves, really. I think we all know, if we're being truthful with ourselves, that we don't just have one self, we have multiple selves, and they're changing like constantly. Like probably within this very long answer to this question, it's already changed multiple times. And like this persona is different than my teaching persona that you see at Quinnipiac. We teach at the same university, by the way. It's different from like my executive director hat at Broken Poets. Very different from my like father self of like 2 kids, 2 and under. Different from my husband's self, my son's self, all of that. So, and I just like the reason why I started working on these really long poems is I felt like the earlier poems, while I liked them, they weren't capturing all of that. Like they were capturing just like part of me, but there was a lot of me that was not being registered in the poem. So like insecurity, maybe one thing, because like you'll write these poems and like you want people to like you, and like you want to be like this awesome poet, like, oh, people will love this poem, right? So like even if it's subconscious, like you don't realize how much you're like putting a veneer on the persona packaging. So I really want, and I'm still most likely doing that. Like I'm not admitting like the worst things that I've ever done. Like I don't think anyone would ever do that. So like I still want you to like me when you read this book. But I like, as my career has progressed, I've been trying to get more and more of like shameful in there, stuff I feel guilty about, stuff that is not flattering. And it doesn't even have to be like big mistakes I've made, but just like these small moments of insecurity like you've highlighted. Okay, that feels like a good place to end.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of talking too long.
It's okay.
In my
It's okay.
answers.
You did sneak into the poems that you're very tall.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did I put that in my poems?
Yeah. There's a poem that says that
That's
you're very
true. There is one in there. Yeah. About my Asian sexuality. It's because people expect us to be short.
But you're tall.
Yeah. I've been told by many people, like, wow, you're tall. And I know where that's coming from. They're surprised.
Well, speaking of change, speaking of time, this is a collection that's really preoccupied with time. The first poem is called After the Election, takes place the day after the election. But then every
2016, you should say.
2016.
Yeah.
But then every
And
section
here we are again.
in the same situation.
Yeah.
Then every section has dates. The
Mhm.
first one is January to April 2016. The
Yeah.
second's like in 2018. But then in the third one, you go back to March 2016.
Right.
So first of all, why was it so important to be so exact?
Yeah.
Usually poetry books just have markers of
Mhm.
time, like seasons.
Right.
And second of all, why isn't it chronological?
Why isn't it chronological? Yeah, both great questions. So I guess the first part of the answer will just be pragmatic. So like originally it was not like that. I just had it like the poet way, where I had like the Roman numeral section numbers.
poet
And I
was.
was just hoping everyone would figure out that it was moving back and forth in time. But then, you know, like I finished this book in 2020. And then, I mean, like I wrote the last poem for it. And I was still editing and revising, but I started sending it out to presses and contests, and it you know it wasn't getting taken. And at that point, it was like extra long. So like this is already really long, but it was about 50 pages longer. So like the summer before it got taken by Diode, I really like set out to both condense it to try to cut out anything that I didn't think was absolutely essential. But then like the more I thought about it, I thought like I think time markers would really help because it is such a long book. It's a very different book than people I think are used to reading for poetry, and there is a narrative. Like I call it, I always thought of it like essays in verse, but after I actually came up with that sort of marketing idea, and then the book was published, I was like, really, it's more like a novel in verse. It's just maybe I have too much respect for novelists. I always thought that was silly to try to call it that, but like the time structure and the way that it goes back and forth, it is very novelistic. In fact, when Gabby wrote this blurb, the really long one you see on the bottom, and she talked about there being a protagonist. Maybe it's just because I'm me. I don't think of myself as a protagonist, but like, you know, the more I thought about it, like there really is a narrative with the protagonist, and that protagonist, like we see him, like the main narrative is from the start of January 2016 when I started the book to August of 2016. And at first I thought that would be the book. In fact, I'd finished the last poem in August 2016 after I turned 40. That was the year I turned 40. And I thought that would be it. But as is usually the case, just when you think a book is done, like you're just getting started usually. Like more poems were coming, and the poems that came later were actually, I think, the strongest ones in a lot of ways in the book. And then obviously like life was happening too. And you know, and I thought the book was done again in 2020, and then COVID happened. And I remember very distinctly when that happened in March of 2020 I just felt like, well, there's got to be another poem now. Like this book is not, I thought it was done, but now this has to be, I have to write one more about this. And then when I wrote that, I had a very distinct sense of like, oh, this is actually a book of like the Trump presidency, because it starts with that. The first poem, as Bessie said, is like the day after the election, when a friend of mine from high school that Redmond knows from high school actually killed himself. And I don't think that had anything to do with the election, but I always remember that day because of how crazy that day was for all of us that knew him. But yeah, looking back on it, I wanted to, I think, reflect, you know, this idea of like no rest, like there being no rest to all of the shit you have to deal with, like Amali was kind of saying in her intro, and how that's like playing out in 2016, which I thought was going to be the best year of my life because I met my future wife. The Cavs won the title. Cleveland had a championship for the first time in like 4 decades. And then Trump was elected at the end of the year, and I just did not see that coming. I thought there was no way, and I think like many of us, I thought there was no way in hell that would ever happen. And then that happened. So I just realized this whole year has actually just been about how I've been totally self-absorbed. And then because of that, I tried to, you know, become even more vigilant with my brain. But I think what the later poems are also showing is like it's still continuing. Like 2018, 2019, 2020, like COVID too. Like here I am at the beginning of COVID going to the AWP Writers Conference. I'm just like, oh, it's fine. Like, why is everyone freaking out? It's not like the NBA is closing down or something. And then a week after I got back, that's what happened. So like that failure of like the mind and the imagination continues, you know, and like, so yeah, I think that's why it goes back and forth in time, I think.
Yeah.
But also I just wanted to make it clear for everyone, the narrative. Yeah. So that they didn't think it was happening chronologically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, connected to that, I think one of the biggest themes is the feeling fed up.
Yeah.
There's no rest. There's
now we're
always
going to talk
more.
About school, right?
Yes, we're going to talk about school, our favorite topic.
Yeah.
We do teach at the same university. How do I put this? So, did you learn anything in
this
writing?
Is being live stream, remember?
Yes, don't worry. I won't cost us our contracts.
It's fine. I'm sure it's fine. Nobody's watching.
From
From our school, nobody's watching.
Nobody's watching from our school. Did you learn anything about how to survive the feeling of being in an academic space, for instance, predominantly white? You and I are the only non-white people in our department. We were just talking about how neither I get to teach immigrant fiction nor Jason gets to teach Asian American lit, even though it's literally the thing.
But other people teach it.
But other people teach it. And I don't know, when I read your book, I felt so exhausted, and I had only been working at Quinnipiac for a couple months, and I felt so exhausted. So, and you've been doing it for 12 years. I guess I'm wondering if you've come at the end out of it with some understanding of how do we keep doing the work.
Yeah, I wish I could say I have an answer for you. I don't think I do. I mean, I think you just, as much as you can, you just keep going, you know, like I would love to, I mean, hopefully no one's watching from Quinnipiac. I would love to leave academia if I could, but you know, I have like benefits there, I have retirement, and it's like, I got to find another job. But I mean, I think the preoccupation of the book and the title, and you'll see this poem I'm going to read is it's not about my university, but it's about, you know, the whiteness of my university, which is and has been a predominantly white institution. This idea of like rest and no rest, and like how we get burned out is, and I wouldn't even call myself an activist in the way that many people are, but I try to do what I can. And everyone gets burned out. And I feel like, you know, even when we feel like we can kind of take a step back and not do more because we will say to ourselves we're burned out, I think that sort of statement to ourselves has something to do with our privilege as well. Like, you know, this is, you know, when I'm like in the book at various times, I'm comparing myself to Audre Lorde as I do in this poem that I'm going to read. And I just wonder, like, oh, is this okay for me? Am I not saying anything because I'm Asian as opposed to black, right? As opposed to a queer black woman, I'm like an Asian guy, right? So, yeah, but as you know, I'm older now than when I wrote these poems, and I think when I wrote the poems, like I was tired, but I was also, I think, inspired and empowered by the sense that like the poems I was writing would enact some change. And definitely in 2020, I think we all felt that summer, that summer of protests, and that a lot was happening at that school. In fact, that was the first time at my school that people started bringing pressure to the administration. But this is why, again, what I like about the time structure of this book, it's like it shows you 1 year, but then it shows you like the next 4 years, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like when you see a movie about like, oh, here's this inspirational movie about these protests, I'm like, this happened and they made change. But then I would love to see, okay, but what happened over the next 4 years at the same time? Because like what's happened over the next 4 years from 2020 to 2024 at my school was like all the change that we tried to bring it's kind of been like instantiated in the language of the institution, like on their website and everything, but it has not played out like in actuality, right? So in fact, a lot of the people that were creating that change, like the people they had empowered in the administration, they've all left. Like they, you know, resigned from their jobs. They took other jobs because, you know, so I'm like, there's like one person watching from Quinnipiac and it's
That's
Provost.
it for us.
But yeah, it's just been, and I, you know, and honestly, I expected that. I think on some level, like I think I was hopeful, but also not, right?
Yeah.
So, and now I'm just 4 years older, and I've got 2 kids, and I'm just like, what energy do I have left? But you know, time moves on. We get to hire a new person. Now you're there. You're in the shit with me, and honestly, I mean, I say that cynically, but it does matter because like last year was like one of the more bearable years because I could talk to you and you could talk to me. Imagine being there and I wasn't there.
Oh, I would leave.
That's what my life was like for like 12 years.
All right, we have time for one more question and to end on a hopeful note. Can you tell me what rest means to you?
Oh, wow, great follow-up. What rest means to me? I mean, the meaning has really changed now that I have kids because I started this book before I had kids. And we had 2 kids in 2022 and 2023. So yeah, what does rest mean? It certainly doesn't mean like I just traveled. You think like when you're a parent, you're like going to travel, you're going to sleep in a hotel. You're like, oh my God, it's going to be amazing. I'm going to sleep for like 8 hours. You don't sleep. It's like the same. Like your brain is still wired on your kids' time. I think if I think about it, it means peace. And I say that because I don't know if I've felt that, at least not recently.
Yeah.
You know, and again, when you do have young kids, like you try to remember the last time you felt really rested, and I cannot remember the last time I felt really rested. It's like, and it's not just my kids. Like I'm trying to think back, like when was that? I think it was certainly pre-COVID.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say like some measure of peace, which would have to have something to do with like the state of the world, you know, like being at least in some sense of harmony. But boy, it just feels like it's not going in that direction, right? I mean, I guess, do we feel hopeful that Kamala is?
Yes.
No, I think we feel better that she can put together a sentence without us all being alarmed. Yeah, I just feel like the fall is going to get really ugly.
Yeah.
You know, like I've been talking about this with you at my school. Like I felt like the tone in the classrooms and the conversations we were having changed after the summer of 2020. Even as crazy it was, like teaching hybrid with like masks on for a while. Like from 2020 to 2022 was different, and then I just noticed this last year, it was just a different tone. Like I was teaching Claudia Rankin's book, Just Us, which I've taught the last 3 years. And this year the conversations were very different. And I was getting pushback, and there was like some real hostile tension that I had to try to navigate. And I feel like I did it unsuccessfully. So I don't know what it's going to be like in the fall.
But we'll have each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
We'll cry and hug. Okay, so yeah,
Yes.
I should read. Thank you for coming, everyone, by the way, especially to Nick's kid. And I hope you get more ice cream afterward because you deserve it. I remember the first time my older daughter had ice cream. It was like just fascinating to watch her. So this poem is called The Rest is Silence. As I mentioned, it's about my institution, and it sort of begins with this series of job interviews we were doing. And we were only interviewing white candidates. This happened pre-COVID. Luckily, by the time we did interviews for Bessie's position, that was not happening anymore. But it was not great. So I think I'll just read it. I don't think you need a lot of prefatory comments. The title is based on, you probably know this already since you're all literary folks, the title is based on the last words that Hamlet speaks at the end of his play. The rest is silence. I've been sitting at this window in Micro for the past hour and a half on a Friday afternoon in Hamden, watching folks come in to start their weekends, and every single one of them has been white. I came here to unwind after a phone interview a few colleagues and I conducted with 3 job candidates, all white. I was the only one participating, not white. All of the other 7 finalists the other subcommittees are interviewing are white. All of the other subcommittee profs are white. We will likely hire 3 new white profs to join a department in which all but one of its 14 full-time profs, are white. At no point will we talk, unless I bring it up, about the problem of adding 3 new white profs to this all but all-white department. Because our job applicant pool, according to HR, yielded a 7% diversity rating, 3% below the national average, but deemed acceptable. There were 93 candidates, so 6, maybe 7 people of color self-identified. In my advanced poetry workshop this semester, every student is white. In my intro to poetry course, 17 out of 18 are white. These percentages are typical. They've been so since I started here in 2012. They are apparently acceptable. Less than 7% diversity. When I got to this bar, not many people were here. I was feeling good. I liked the hickory smoked chicken wings, locally brewed IPAs. But as one by one every new white person filed in, I felt myself shrinking into a tinier percentage, becoming more and more microscopic. I'm not surprised. I've been to this bar many times. It's my favorite bar in Hamden. I like to come here after work to have a beer and work on things before hitting the road back home to Brooklyn. Always it is all white except for me. It's like our thing. Mind you, not almost all white. All white. 6:30 now and the happy hour weekend crowd is pouring in. The place is packed. I look up and watch every new white customer walk in with a peculiar, dangerous sort of pleasure, like I'm itching a rash. I'm lucky this doesn't bother me that much. I know when I come here I'm going to leave and drive back home to Brooklyn. But imagine if I lived here. When people at my school, students and faculty alike, ask me why I don't live here, why I commute an hour and a half from Brooklyn, they don't understand how this is a racist question. Imagine if I told them that. Man, how can you bear that commute? Man, how can you bear that racist question? Look around you in this bar. Look at every single person walking through that door. Let's count how many people look like me by the end of the night. Do you ever do that obligatory room check, turning to scan the faces around you to see how many non-white ones there are? No? Well, maybe don't ask me about my commute then. It's that never having occurred to you that this room might be a problem, might make some people uncomfortable, might make them consciously or unconsciously change their behavior, their very personality, that reveals your racist blindness. No, that's not the right word. It's too strong. Ableist suggests there's something wrong with you, some flaw, whereas you don't think there's anything wrong. It's a racist innocence. And you're not wrong. What's so bad about what's happening here? Are these bad people? Is anyone saying some racist shit or not serving me or causing me physical harm? Am I not being included like everyone else? Am I not being treated equally? I couldn't call you a racist. You're not doing anything. I would never tell you to your face you're asking me a racist question or explain you're enjoying a racist innocence, except in this poem. I wouldn't want to do that to you. You're too innocent. It's not your fault. I'd immediately feel like an asshole. And that's the problem, isn't it? Innocent. You go on innocent, places like this go on innocently looking this way. What's the bar supposed to do? Institute some kind of diversity quota? It's a business. These are the people who live here. These are its customers. It needs to make money. There's nothing racist about that, right? It's not turning people of color away or not serving them. The people who work here are all nice. I've never had a problem other than seeing white person after white person walk in without interruption, which is not against the law. Maybe I'm just a whiner, overly sensitive. I don't have to drink here. I don't even live here. What's the bar supposed to do? Offer free beer to people of color? Host people of color nights? That would be absurd, right? Hire more people of color to change the complexion of the room and attract more customers of color? That would be against the law, potentially, if it were found the bar hired POC over more qualified white candidates. And let's be real, how many POC work in the craft beer industry compared to white folks, especially in this area? You'd have to go out of your way to find someone when there are all these super qualified white folks already available to hire. And they're all so nice, hardworking, experienced. Most importantly, they love beer. They're passionate about it. It's the one thing in their life they care about the most. They'd fit right in here. They'd hit the ground running. Whereas a person of color, would they even be happy? Would they want to stay? Wouldn't they have other interests, aspirations? This job is not easy. It's mostly grunt work. A person with aspirations might find it difficult to endure, especially if they already feel out of place. All of this reasoning makes sense even as I sit here feeling more microscopic, sipping my white beer. What's funny is how absurd diversity initiatives seem at a bar that do not at a university. Offering free beer to bring POC into the space seems hilarious in the imagination, especially when I picture furious white customers, whereas offering financial aid at a university does not. What's funny is what's not so funny. Diversity initiatives at a bar only seem absurd because not enough people are talking about them to give them traction. Admitting POC or women into a university, let alone giving them financial aid, seemed as absurd, if not more so, to white gents not so long ago. And by absurd, I mean so against the natural historical inertia of the norm as to seem like a physical violation. That inertia is the bedrock of all true power, the saturation of the same so be it that has always been. What makes a 7% diversity rating acceptable? What can we do about it? These are the people who applied. We don't know how many of them self-identified. This is our demographic. It's not our fault POC are not taking advantage of this opportunity. We made it available to everyone. What are we supposed to do? Redo the whole job search? Change the qualifications? Cast a wider net with our advertising? Change the whole way we do business? Who is going to do all that work and spend all that money? You? Of course not me. I'm not in charge here. If I were, the whole business would be built differently from the ground up. Inclusivity and diversity would be part of the very fabric of how we do things. We wouldn't need to pay for outside assessment of our diversity or hire a chief diversity officer or construct a strategic plan for increasing diversity, a plan that slyly gives a company convenient cover if anyone should point out the factual lack of diversity among their ranks and the problems arising because of that. Now there's official language proving the company takes diversity seriously and is doing something about it. A simulacrum of diversity, including a definition that expands its meaning beyond race and gender to include class, ability, sexuality, age, religion, education, and pretty much anything under the sun, so that looked at this way, diversity has already been achieved. There's no need to do anything despite what the strategic plan seems to suggest by its existence, if not by what it actually says. The company brilliantly grows so inclusive by the letter of its own laws to become more exclusive, as now white job committees can hire more white employees to entrench their own diversity. There was a yesterday I find almost impossible to lift, as Elizabeth Bishop said at the end of her career, not talking about race, but I feel it mid-career, or perhaps pre-career, as whatever career I have always feels like a prelude to an actual one, and this because of race. I can say something about our lack of diversity to my department, how for us in our school this starts with race, as we don't have a gender issue and race is the most easily visible form of diversity missing here, making any POC uncomfortable and strangely causing even more discomfort to white folks when the subject is brought up. They won't go out of their way to increase racial diversity, but they'll go out of their way to talk about this problem, acting like they want to do something, saying, we need to have a conversation about this. Then having meeting after meeting where talk replaces action and postpones the problem for another meeting. But will talk of any kind change the room around me? Look at where I'm sitting. Imagine me saying something. What would the reaction be? Who would I say something to? Another customer? The bartender? The manager? The owner? Where would I even start? At least at a university, there's some kind of intellectual and political context for what I'd like to say, but at a bar on a Friday night? There might be some talk here and there about the problems of race in America, but no one wants to hear that the problem is them, especially on a Friday night. What did they do? They're just trying to kick back and have a good time. And truthfully, I don't think they are the problem. The problem starts so far in back of us and all the yesterdays that have built up this room and others like it without question. There's no moving the massive weight of them without total cataclysm or by tiny, incremental, all but imperceptible shifts that feel like waiting or doing nothing. So saying something feels in the end, because there is no end, like silence. Except now you're full of unrest because you've caused unrest. You've ruined everyone's happy hour, starting with your own. I just want to sit here after work and eat these hickory smoked chicken wings and drink these locally brewed IPAs, not so ruefully aware of how doing so participates in and bankrolls this handcrafted whiteness, how my tastes, which feel so particular to me, are informed by whiteness of a certain kind that I perceive as cool and try to embody with my own Asian slant. This bar, I know, appeals to me because it looks and feels like Brooklyn, starting with it being housed in a renovated historic building, or at least what looks like such a building. The name is corny, but this is the closest you're going to get to Brooklyn and Hamden. I recognize all the Brooklyn design touches, how Brooklyn itself is an import for any place trying to commodify its local historic identity, and this is a white Brooklyn. I'm such a sucker for it. Much as I say I'm becoming uncomfortable with all the white people walking in, obviously I feel more comfortable here than anywhere else in Hamden. I keep coming here, though this keeps happening. Something about this place feels inclusive, or inclusive enough to keep me consuming rather than speaking out about its problems, except in the space of this poem. And let's face it, a poem is a more acceptable way of breaking silence. It can be ignored, especially one this long, and doesn't ruin anybody's happy hour. In fact, it goes well with happy hour if read for some indie reading series at your neighborhood bar. I can even see it working here. Though there might be some initial discomfort, everyone likes to be challenged politically and made uncomfortably aware of our nation's problems when there's a time limit, booze, and packaging as art and entertainment. It's a good discussion starter. Edgy, an edifying hors d'oeuvre to clear the conscience before the evening's inanities. And I'm not too angry, which helps. Look at how I've already qualified my complaints by showing how I'm complicit in everything I'm complaining about, reassuring whiteness that there's no real problem here. Everyone can go back to their drinks. Plus, I'm Asian American. White folks don't find my kind that threatening anymore, at least not since Executive Order 9066. I might not feel I fit in, but I fit in. Asian American is the new white, or the closest to white of any POC, which I find troubling to say the least. How many times do you see a room full of white people and the only or the most POC present are Asian? I almost wonder if we even count anymore. I see this so often. I only don't see it here because I'm that one present, just as I am in my department. The problem is not much better in New York City. During meetings of the 2019 Whitman Consortium consisting of 70-plus organizations planning to celebrate the bicentennial of Whitman's birth, I was the only POC at the table. A couple others sat on the margins, but they were not the heads of their organizations. Only I, Asian American, got to sit in the circle with all the esteemed white heads representing some of the most prestigious literary wealth in the country. We shared how we were going to celebrate the poet of democracy, the one white father in June Jordan's estimation who shared the systematic disadvantages of his heterogeneous offspring trapped inside a closet. That's a quote from Jordan. And all I could think was, this is us 200 years later? What would Jordan have thought of this room? There were plenty of women in charge, but all white. A few gay men I knew, white, and me. And I had to create my own organization and build it big enough to gain white approval to get a seat at that table. I didn't feel proud of this or like I had any power, but small. Smaller than I usually do when I'm dreaming big dreams alone or among my peoples, because I'm not seeing the stakes of the game laid out with such physical reproof. There was no moving any weight at that table. Someone asked if the consortium was going to say anything about Whitman's problematic views on race, and another person said, yes, thank you for bringing up that issue. And another said, I think it would be best to get out in front of this, as if it were a PR problem. I put in my 1 cent about the importance of getting people of color involved, especially young ones, connecting Whitman to those heterogeneous offspring Jordan imagined he stood for. But I didn't say it in just this way. I didn't mention Jordan's quote. I didn't want to come off as confrontational. In fact, I don't remember exactly what I said. It might as well have been silence for all the difference it made. I've taken part in event after event celebrating Whitman over the past few months, and save for the one I myself organized, there were no or almost no POC speaking or performing other than me. And perhaps more alarmingly, almost no POC present in the audiences. These events were in New York City, not Hamden. I went to speak in support of a coalition trying to get Whitman's last standing NYC home at 99 Ryerson Street considered for landmarking at a Landmarks Preservation Commission hearing on 6 proposed LGBTQ sites, not including Whitman's. And I was the only POC offering public testimony in our group. I did that obligatory room check and saw just one older Asian gentleman and one black woman at the otherwise white table of commissioners, another black woman sitting off to the side of the table who presented research on why Audre Lorde's last home in Staten Island should be landmarked, and one black man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap sitting with the rest of us in the public. He rose to speak on the Lorde case. We'd already heard several prepared statements of support delivered by smart white folks representing LGBTQ interests, but I was most interested in what this man had to say. As a lone black man in the audience, I assumed he was going to offer support, but then got a lesson in the complexities of identity politics that Lorde spent a lifetime trying to work out. He didn't not offer support. He said he wasn't against landmarking the house, but he was against the LPC writing him, the owner of that house for over 20 years, to say he'd built an illegal deck at the back of it. The house was already designated as historic by the LPC in 2004 as part of the St. Paul's Avenue Stapleton Heights Historic District, and thus already protected from major alterations, hence this letter. You might wonder why the house had to be landmarked if it was already protected, and I assume this was to give it some kind of additional protection, honor its cultural, not just architectural significance, and also to mark it as a political win for the LGBTQ community in the year celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. But this man didn't care about any of that. He didn't mention Lorde once or show pride in what the house represented. He took pride in that deck, how much money and time and care he invested in it. He said if you'd looked at the back of the house, not pictured in the slideshow when he'd bought it, you'd have seen a window that looked like it was originally a door, probably leading to a deck that had been removed. All the other houses on his historic block had decks except his. So in his mind, he'd been doing the work of restoration, not alteration. He was the one who'd painted the house the way it looks today, who'd kept it so convincingly historic. He didn't know why he was being penalized, and he was worried landmarking the house would make it even more difficult for him to save his dick. He got the loudest applause of any speaker in the room, but I wondered what the LGBTQ contingent thought of him, whether they felt sympathy or perceived him as a threat. Lord herself would have been keenly aware of all the ironies in play. White LGBTQ activists like those she often clashed with over race, working to honor her role in their cause, and race again irritatingly getting in the way in the form of a black man troubling their unified front, protecting his own interests and exposing the whiteness of their own. A man she may have clashed with too, who didn't seem to know or care at all who she was, who might have seen her sexuality as a betrayal of their own unified black front against white interests. I don't know who Lord would have sided with or if they were even opposed, but I doubt she would have been for having her home landmarked if it meant that black Vietnam vet would have to suffer the loss of his deck. I think she would have been suspicious of any coalition of white interests advancing upon a black citizen's autonomy. And she definitely would have said something. She would have braved the return fire. Though I don't know if she would have said anything about this bar, if she would have thought it worth the unrest. But maybe calculations like this prove our difference, my greater alignment with whiteness, my ability to choose rest or unrest, when for her, the rest was silence. Thank you.
Very nice.
It's long.
Yeah.
It's 20 minutes. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I was reading that poem as you walked in as a white man. This is my friend. I don't know if you were aware of that. I was like, Bill's walking in. He's gonna hate me now. I was like, white person after white person walks in. Here comes my friend Bill.
I was crawling.
Anyway.
Well, now it's you
Audience
guys'
questions?
turn.
Yeah.
I have kind of a craft question when you were talking about, the chronology of your book. And then sort of in the beginning, we were talking about how we're living in, unprecedented time after unprecedented time. Like, how do you know, I guess, did you know going in, I guess the answer is no, as I'm asking
You're
the
answering.
question. Like, how do you know when it is done? Like, taking us, like, at a glance, you have to look at it all at a glance and say, like, what is the thread that I'm weaving here? Or, how did it change as you were writing it? And how did you know when it was done, when you could close it?
It's a great question. I mean, it's always a great question. I mean, I think when I started in January 2016 when I was on winter break. One of the nice things about academia is you get nice long breaks. And I was very conscious when I started of not having a plan. I'd done my previous book, and I was like, and this was even before it was actually published, but I was just kind of fucking around in my notebooks, and I had this idea that I was like wanting to explore these long poems. Ironically, I wanted to write a book of essays. I thought that would be the next book, not this book. But when I write prose, it's like excruciating. So I don't know how you prose writers do it. Like, it's so slow for me. But I know I can write a really long poem very fast. Like, I can write a 20-page long poem in like, not like a few days, but like it goes faster than if I were to write a 20-page essay. That would take me like months. So I just started kind of doodling around in my notebook, and I had like those first poems are not in the book anymore. But I kind of arrived, you'll see it if you look at the book, like I arrived at this couplet form, which I'd always liked, but I had never really written in. And I almost think I had been saving it. There's this poet I really like named A.R. Ammons, who towards the end of his career started writing these really long book-length poems in couplets. And he'd always been a great poet, but this form seemed to like free him to be like funnier and more insouciant than he'd ever been. I always really admired those poems. But I felt like it was too easy for whatever reason. I just felt like, for whatever reason, I just felt like I could do it. So I was like, I don't want to do that yet. I need to learn how to like write an iambic pentameter and like write sonnets. So I did that for many years. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna do this because I feel like I can just make this work. And it's taking a long time to get to your question. So I started doing this, and I didn't really have a sense of not only the ending, but like the beginning. Like I didn't really know where it was going. And I think I wrote like 3 or 4 of those. But I did have some consciousness of like trying to bring like more of my political thinking into the book. Like, I mean, it wasn't like a very explicit thing, like I need to write political poems. And like Trump wasn't really in the picture yet. Like it's like January 2016. I couldn't see that on the horizon. But as the year started to unfold, and I was dealing with stuff at my university, like one thing that happened that year, even though I said I thought it was going to be like the best year of my life, is like, I'm not tenure track at my university, but like they had started this weird parallel non-tenure track line that they called teaching professor, which Bessie is also one.
Yeah.
That's like their thing now. They don't want to do tenure track. So it's not tenure track, but like you were offered like some stability, right? And you could actually even get promoted. So I was an assistant teaching professor, and that year I was up for review to become associate teaching professor. And I am now, but the first year I was up for it that year, I was actually denied, which was like, it's hard for me to remember now because now I am, but that was really like very traumatic for me. Cause like, again, like I was the only non-white person in my department and everyone else was tenured. So I was like the only one in me and I couldn't understand like why, like what were they basing that on? And part of the problem was like, if you're in that line, as I've been trying to tell Bessie to her misfortune, is that they don't look at your publications at all. So I'd been doing all this writing and publishing, but when they were reviewing me, they were like, well, we're not even going to look at that. We're only going to look at your teaching and service. And they looked really hard at my evals, and if you teach, you know that if you're a person of color, like your evals are tricky. And I had happened to go through a really bad period of evals. Like there was once, and I don't even know honestly what it was. Like I probably wasn't teaching that well, to be honest, but like they were like crazy bad. Like there was one class, they were just like clearly out to like get revenge for some reason. Like they just hated me. Anyway, it's hard to look back on that moment, but like that happened. So I think as that was happening, I started becoming more conscious of university life and like what that was like. And I'm gonna try to fast forward this to get to answer your question. But then like 2016 passed, and then like, you know, Trump was elected, and we started moving forward in time over the course of the book. And there were two moments, like both when I was writing this poem and then when I wrote the COVID poem. I mentioned like even before I wrote that poem, thinking I had to write a poem about the outbreak of COVID. But I remember sitting in that LPC meeting, and I felt like the book was about done. In fact, I had already written what I thought was the last poem, which was about turning 40. Like I had these, you write these poems, like they're very big. You're like, this feels very closey. This feels like a closer. And like, I felt pretty good about it. And at that point, the book was like a manageable, relatively normal poetry book length, about like 100 some pages. And that's also like a practical consideration. You think, okay, like that's about done now. It's like, that's like more than enough. And then I was sitting in that meeting, and like that, I've had a few of these experiences in my life, but this was like very much more urgent than any. I was like thinking to myself, like, oh, this is, as I'm sitting there and that the Black Vietnam vet rose up to speak, I was thinking to myself, like, oh, this is going in the poem. Like, I just, like, my mind was computing, like, this whole thing I know now is going into the book, because like I had been writing that poem about the job search at Quinnipiac, and I thought I was about done with it, but I wasn't quite sure how it was going to end. And then that happened. And I was like, oh, this poem is actually much bigger than I thought it was. It's not just about the white institution. And in fact, when I read it now, hopefully you liked it, but I'm almost a little bored by the first part where it's just like, oh, all these white people, like, what, you know, woe is me. I'm like kind of past that now. Like, it's fine. And I'm much more interested in the last part, where it's just like much more complex. And like you realize it's not as simple as like, oh, there's all these white people and there's me and my life sucks because everyone is racist. And it's just never that simple. And then you have all this intersectionality with like the LGBTQ activists and you know, also people thinking about race and all kinds of things to be thinking about. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's definitely like a strong intuition, at least for me. And then again with COVID, I think the thing is, like, as you write a book, especially with this one, because I was using the same form all the time, like I got better and better at that form. And the poems started to get longer. They started to get more multi-layered. And so by the time I was like at this poem that I read tonight, and then before I wrote the COVID poem, I felt like I was just like a machine. Like I knew how to write this kind of poem. And I knew how to like weave in different kind of narratives at that point. And I knew that that's what the book was doing, right? And I hadn't written a book like that before. So that was exciting to me. But yeah, like COVID, I was just like, well, what chance are you going to have to write about this again? And I didn't want that to be like the first poem of the next book. I was like, I just want to write about this now and never write about it again. And then it'll just cap this 4-year project I've been working on. God, that was such a long answer. I'm just, ever since I wrote this book, I'm just like so conscious of my answers are so digressive. Yeah. Hopefully that answered.
Yes, totally. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm feeling this poem. I have your first. I don't know if it's your first book, but it's the book before this one.
The one with the super long poem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was one you were talking about. Porn.
Yeah. More than mere light.
Yeah.
I was talking about porn. Is that what you said? Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
That does happen in that poem.
When
Yeah.
you throw yourself almost kind of like Charles Olson, like there's a projected verse kind of vibe here. Not composition by field, but just like you're kind of throwing yourself onto the rhythms of these really nuanced emotions.
Yeah.
Do you find that the long form like reduces the pressure like of a short poem? Like the short poem has this like dynamite compression effect, right?
Yeah.
And I feel with the long form, I feel that compressive dynamite is gone. And now it feels more like your ship at sea.
Yeah.
Like you're just kind of being.
This is great. You can tell he's a poet, right? This is I'm just like this is such a beautiful question.
But yeah, I guess how do you navigate experience while you're writing, being pushed and pulled by those nuances?
Yeah.
Because they
Great
are
question.
smaller, complex, kind of dialectical back and forth.
Right.
Which are wondrous, but sometimes hard to capture.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm loving this. He's like doing this with this. That's such a beautiful question. I wish I could well, I guess it's kind of recorded. Yeah, I write them over a period of days. And that, so in fact, even the shorter poems I was writing that I mentioned that I used to write for the first couple books, even those I would write over a period of days. Like my process is, I think, very different from most poets. It's much more like a prose writer's process. Where I very early on, I tried to resist that like compressed dynamite thing you're talking about, because I feel like some of my earlier poems that I liked, I wouldn't say they're ruined, but but I felt like I left them too quickly, and there was more there. And the thing is, if you leave them, it congeals, and you can't get back in the process anymore. Like you think it's done, or you workshop it, and it's kind of over. Right? Like I would highly recommend to any of you poets, they're like, don't workshop something like you're not quite sure is ready yet. So I started to go in the other direction. So even if I knew something was gonna be kind of short, I would spend days building it. And I also hated the anxiety of being between poems. So I tried to stay inside a poem as long as possible, like this inside the writing of it. And that's why I like the long poem, because you can stay inside of it. And then what I really like is, it's going over sometimes a couple weeks, especially once you start revising it, and more of your experience is coming in. Yeah. Right. So again, this poem I was just talking about, The Rest of Silence, I thought it was about, I was literally sitting at this bar micro in this window watching the white people come in, thinking to myself, oh, this is the start of a poem right here. The first lines literally started coming to me. And I started writing it actually right there. And then, time passed and I was still working on it. And then I went to this LPC meeting to save Whitman's home. And then it sort of gave, the experience gave me that ending. And I feel like it could have been, I think it would have been a good poem anyway. In fact, I sent it to some journals. I remember Greg Pardlow. He's like, I feel like it should end earlier with the bar. Don't even go to the Audre Lorde stuff. And I was like, I think the Audre Lorde stuff is the best part. But yeah, it's in some ways you don't really know. It's very much a kind of anti sort of modernist. I don't know if that's a modernist model, or this idea there's the perfect poem that's timeless. I feel like I gave up on that idea long ago. I'm much more into how is experience going to push the poem and layer it in these ways, because time will be contained in the poem in a way that I love sonnets, but I don't think they contain time in the same. They just don't. I think formally they can't. A sonnet cannot contain time the way that Byron's Don Juan can, or one of Ashbery's long poems can, because they're being written over days and weeks and sometimes months and years.
Yeah, just a quick, because I have to head out.
Yeah.
When you were writing this, I felt that there was so much openness towards one's own complicity within the larger systems we live in. But you were writing this, I feel like, at a time when there was more militancy being called for.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that friction because especially poetry, especially during the Trump years, really was like like punching above its weight.
Yeah.
And to its credit, a lot of it was still poetry, but some of it kind of crossed the line and went to like bullhorn propaganda.
Right.
So I'm just curious, like as a man of color, how did you feel being called to be like on the front lines, more militant, and at the same time, like, but poetry is a different type of fight.
Yeah, it's a great question. I understand where that question's coming from. I think that actually felt like my angle, so to speak. Angle sounds like a manipulative, calculating term. Like I felt like that was actually the way I can contribute best, especially as an Asian American male, where we're not usually thought of or expected to be militant in the same way, and if you are, it's like a little weird for some people. I don't know why these things are. I didn't feel some of the things in the same way, and I recognize my like being more adjacent to whiteness, not just because of being Asian, but because of class, right? Like my parents are immigrants, but like I'm upper middle class based on like what my dad did as a doctor. So like, and I had a job at a university, right? So like I was closer to whiteness than, a lot of other folks that I knew that were protesting, and I was like in the streets too, but it's different, right? So like, I'm not going to write in that space because it doesn't feel truly authentic to my experience of it. Like I'm still pissed, especially about what was happening at my university. But, like I just never thought that was the true picture. And it's just much more revealing and insightful to like try to look at it. And this, again, I don't think you can do it in a short poem, like a protest poem that's gonna be amazing and be shared on Twitter. Like, and I love those poems, but it's not gonna capture all of that nuance and complexity, which a lot of times people don't even want, including me. Sometimes we don't want any nuance. We just want to be angry and yell, right? And there's a reason for that, right? But I don't feel like that's where my talent and voice and style really lies. Like I feel like I'm in the cut in this other way. Like I'm kind of like the lingerer and kind of just like waiting and seeing and how is this playing out? I mean, at least for this book, it may change. Who knows? Maybe one more question. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just, my question has to do with what you've been talking about, and like on page 97, that great part where it's like, look how I've already qualified my complaints by showing how I'm complicit in everything.
Right.
And I love the essaying in the poems that is this sort of halfway to the cheese constantly. I'm going to keep trying to undo the opportunism of being a poet on the page, saying these things. And I wonder, as you continue that sort of deliberation, how you were encouraged toward it, how you let yourself have on the, there's that when you were first talking about, I really want you guys to like me, like that little Charlie Simic thing where he says, oh, these poems, they're just like these little personal ads where it's like, aren't they kind of smart and funny and you just want to have a roll in the hay with me, like that's what all the poems are.
Right.
And once we admit that in a poem and try to move closer to what is somehow either the authentic thing you want to say or try to portray. So I'm just wondering who might have encouraged you, Jason, along those lines.
Yeah.
Because it's such a practice.
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like first answer that came to mind was nobody. And it's kind of a joke, but I think it's also true. Like, I mean, nobody really, like, I certainly didn't have a teacher that encouraged that, at least not explicitly. I have had teachers that, and they never saw anything of this length from me. But I think, in a workshop format, how much can you do? But like, I remember there was a class I took with Ed Hirsch back in my Houston days, where I was not the long poem I wrote for this last book, but when I was in grad school, I wrote this very long, what I thought was a long poem, like a 17-page poem that was kind of like an early draft of this 50-some page poem I ended up writing for the third book. It was like a diary-like letter poem that was modeled after James Schuyler's The Morning of the Poem. And I remember not only Ed, but other people in the class, like their reaction to it was different. Like they didn't, because like you'll hear praise for poems, but then And then when people really like something or they really connect to something, the tone of their feedback changes. It's not even so much what they say. It's like, it's just like how they're coming to you. They're like, wow, this, you're really doing something here. Like, you should keep trying to do that. But, I was so young at the time. I just didn't even think, I was like, how is that even possible? But I would say the most encouragement came from the books I was reading, like the poets that I loved, like Schuyler, like Ashbery, Whitman, a lot of dead white dudes, I have to say,
And what about
had the space to do that, right?
Yeah.
So when I say nobody, like, to bring this kind of like to, me as a racial identity, like, I was conscious of like never having read a really long poem by like an Asian guy, right? Or even an Asian woman, right? Or any Asian identity. Like, it was always like these white guys. Like, there were some white women writing long poems, but it was mostly like these straight white guys. And they were really good at it, some of them, at least, like my heroes. But like leaning into that felt like that did feel like I could break ground that way, in a way that like I could just try to take up a ton of space in a way that I had never really been encouraged to take, right? So that's why that was the first thing that came to mind, was actually nobody really encouraged that. It was like kind of like pushing against what I had been encouraged to do, which was pretty much to do nothing, really.
Well,
Yeah.
the poems are like nothing else.
Yeah.
And
Hey, thank
it's
you.
not
Yeah.
nothing
That's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for coming out. Thank you to those who asked questions. Thank you to Bessie for moderating such a great conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jason, for celebrating this month with
You're
us.
welcome.
So, just some final reminders before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the description. For those still with us tonight, if you haven't gotten a copy yet, or if you want another one, we've got some additionals up at the register where you checked in. Jason will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's going to be happening where my coworker Belle is now pointing to. It'll all make a little bit more sense in a moment. We're just going to ask that you all gather your personal belongings, just line up along these shelves and curve right around to the window. Thank you all so much for coming.
This
with
is
me.
yours,
These two of
actually.
us.
Ah.
I haven't signed it yet.